Good afternoon and welcome to Conversations on Showing Up for Kids. My name is Tim Markle. I'm director of the Southern Regional Center for Children and Youth with Special Healthcare Needs out of the Waisman Center. Conversations is this little time that we take out to talk about things that matter to parents and professionals around the world of children and youth with special healthcare needs. Really excited that Kate Szidon is back with us today, mostly excited because she did part one last week. And if she didn't show up today, we would have no idea how the story ends. And so we're really excited to have Kate back to do part two on her presentation on writing quality transition IEPs for students with autism spectrum disorder. So Kate, give me a moment and I am going to pull up the slideshow.
All right. While you're doing that, I'll just quickly introduce myself. For those of you who I haven't met, I am an outreach specialist at the Waisman Center, and I work primarily on projects that are supporting kids, families, and schools who serve students on the autism spectrum. So the information I'm sharing today comes out of a project called the Center on Secondary Education for Students with Autism. If you could raise your hand if you actually got to see part one. I'm just wondering how many of you watched that part and have that initial information that we covered last week.
And you can either raise your hand by turning your camera off or using the emojis. We will respect any way you want to initial that you have seen part one at one time, and it's no problem if you haven't.
Okay. So I would encourage you to look at part one if you haven't seen it, because it does cover the first part of what we were talking about in terms of a transition IEP, which is the collecting information part. And so part two today, we're going to start talking about documenting the plan. And as I was saying, this comes out of the Center on Secondary Education for Students with Autism. And it is initially it was designed to help teachers write better transition IEPs, but we thought it would be a great conversation to have with parents too. So we'll go ahead and get started, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide, Tim. I'm just going to show you first sort of our, so the slide on the transition services flow chart. Is it being difficult for you? Perfect. Yeah. So this is the flow chart we were using in part one. And as you see above the circled section is age appropriate transition assessments. So that's what section one talked about. So last week we covered all sorts of age appropriate transition assessments that give you the data that the team would need to really decide how to best write the plan for a student in high school. And next, we're going to talk about writing those post-secondary goals. And this PowerPoint is designed really to give you a very brief overview of a pretty complex topic. I just wanted to make sure we all knew what we were talking about in terms of what we discuss when we do a transition IEP. And I would like you to feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have questions or comments or specific issues that you want to address today, because that's the reason we're here. So very briefly, I'm going to go through these next 4 areas of this flow chart to really just describe to you how the process works for our students with autism in high school who are transition age. And we move from assessment to writing goals. So next slide, please. Post-secondary goals should answer the following questions. When you do these goals, these are, like, so as you can see from the flow chart, are overarching goals for the child as they become adults. And the questions we're asking is, where are they going to work or engage in any productive activities after they graduate from high school? Where and how are students going to continue to learn or develop skills after they graduate? And where is a student going to live and how are they going to access adult services or participate in the community and have fun after graduation? All of these questions are important questions we as a team want to be asking, so that we can write the best plan while they're still in high school to try and develop those skills they will need to attain those goals. Okay, so that's the purpose of a post-secondary goal, is to sort of provide a map for the team so they know what the aim is for adult living. So moving forward to the next slide, I like this formula for writing the goals for post-secondary goals. Think about it as after high school or after graduation or upon completing high school, and then insert your child's name next, will do a specific behavior and then where and how they're going to do that behavior. So think about these post-secondary goals are different from IEP goals because we're really setting those goals for after they graduate. Okay, next slide talks about some examples of post-secondary goals. Knowing that autism is a spectrum, I'm giving you a variety of sample goals so that you can see goals that might potentially fit your child or your child's situation. So this is for a child who is going to graduate and go on to college. So the example of the post-secondary goals for education, employment, and independent living might be that after graduating from high school, the student will attend a four-year college to obtain an undergraduate degree in history and education to become a high school social studies teacher. So you can see that goal is something they will attain after they graduate. Now, writing these post-secondary goals, it's not a contract. The high school is not ensuring that this is going to happen for your child, but we know that this is what your child aims to be doing after they're done with school. And so knowing that information helps us better prepare their high school programming to best facilitate that happening for them in the future. In terms of employment, after they get their degree from the university, the student will work as a high school history teacher in their hometown. That's what they want to do. And what about their independent living? The student is going to advocate for any accommodations they need to be successful in furthering their education and employment. So independent living encompasses a large, scope of different skills that people might need. And when we think about what we can work on in high school, we want to look for areas that students need to grow in. And so in this case, that area for growth is advocating for themselves. So, and you could see it being different things. So I'll give you a different example in the next slide. So this student is not going to go to a four-year college, but after high school, they will attend a course offered through a Pathways to Employment program at their community college. That's going to be the education that they're shooting for. In terms of their employment, they're looking to be competitively employed, so at least working 20 hours a week in a retail with time-limited supports of a job coach. Okay. And then in terms of their independent living, they're going to assume responsibility for a share of their living expenses. So they're looking to learn how to save money earned at work and follow a budget that's set by them and their parents to chip in on their share of living expenses, wherever that living situation might be. Okay. Another example. So for students who might not go to even a training program, this might be a good goal to be thinking about, or some variation of it. After graduation, Jason will participate in an in-home or center-based program designed to provide habilitative and vocational training with medical and therapeutic supports. So this is a child who has more intensive needs, won't be working independently in the community, but there's definitely a need for education and training, right? In terms of their employment, he's going to be self-employed and do some volunteer work. And then independent living, they'll participate in activities in the community. So this gives us a different framework to go by in planning out that transition IEP. And I think here's just another example for you to look at. So immediately after graduation, Javier will receive job development services from Voc Rehab, and then they will participate in technologically supported self-employment or volunteer work within a year of graduation. So these examples are designed to show you the specificity of these types of post-secondary goals. And the reason we do that in our project is after reviewing lots and lots of transition IEP goals, post-secondary goals, we see a problem sometimes with schools being too general, like they will graduate from high school as a goal. Well, that's something we would expect them to do. The purpose of the post-secondary goal is to really get specifically what that child is interested in pursuing after they graduate in these areas of employment, education, and independent living. Okay. Before we move on, does anyone have any questions about post-secondary goals? Any comments about post-secondary goals?
And you can either unmute yourself and you'll be able to speak out loud, or put your thoughts into the chat and then I will be able to repeat them. Laura?
I just have a question. So can you change the goal? So say prior IEPs had the child planning to attend a post-secondary institution, and then perhaps it's become apparent that the child is not going to be ready for that. Can you change that goal? And at what point would you do so?
Great question. These goals should change. If they're too stagnant, but because, I mean, think about yourself as a high schooler. What you thought you were going to do freshman year of high school when you were thinking about adult living compared to what you wanted to do even after you graduated college. I mean, that's an evolving process. We think of transition as sort of, it's a dynamic process. It shouldn't be you're deciding freshman year and then you're stuck there. But thinking about your comments specifically, Laura, I wonder if, when you say that it looks like they're not going to be able to do that, my question would be why? What are the skills that we need to be teaching if they really want to go to college, which we know is a great option for a lot of students? How can we better help them? So maybe your post-secondary goal would stay the same, but your plan might change drastically if we're recognizing that there's some skills that need to be built, right?
Okay. I think it was more along the lines of current school is kind of saying, well, you had been planning this, and now you're telling us that she's not ready for this. It's almost as if they don't want to be flexible.
Yeah, and it should be really flexible.
Okay.
Because as the child moves through high school, obviously their interests are going to change. They're going to learn more about themselves, and they're going to know more about what they're good at, what things are challenging for them, and what they want to do when they're done with school.
Okay, so you could change something, like say before you didn't think you needed life skills or independent living skills, now that could be added when it's become apparent that those are not going to be achievable by high school graduation.
Absolutely. Yes,
okay.
Absolutely. And we really encourage in our CSESA project that, often independent living skills is seen as sort of like an add-on, or some people need it, but most people don't. For our students on the autism spectrum, and we talked about this in our first session, what we find generally is even for those who have average academic skills, kids who are in general education for most of their classes, when we test them on their independent living skills, they are often significantly behind their peers in lots of those independent living skills. And so we would hope, CSESA, the project, would hope that almost all students on the autism spectrum would be addressing independent living skills in their IEP.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. Any more questions before we move on to the next part? Okay, so next we're going to go right back to our map. since we have our assessments and our post-secondary goals already in mind and everyone knows what the plan is for that year, we're going to move to identifying some transition services. And you might have noticed in the examples, some of them alluded to some of these transition services. And if you look underneath the big turquoise bar, you can see we look at 4 different areas of transition services as possible. So things like instruction, related services that the child might need, community experiences that would be helpful in attaining those goals, and then the development of adult living objectives. So moving forward to the next slide, here are some transition service questions you might ask yourself. Experiences. So what experiences are necessary this academic year, right? So it should change every year. What experiences are necessary this year to achieve the identified post-secondary goals? What services and specific instruction are necessary this year to develop more skills and knowledge to attain those post-secondary goals? And then do we know enough about the students' vocational skills to identify any appropriate post-secondary employment goals or design activities to support identifying those goals? Okay. And these are all the transition service questions. There's a section in the IEP that talks about transition services. And as a team, you should be collaborating to not only identify those services for the year, but to identify who might be working on those things. So it's not necessarily the school district that's going to do all these transition services. You as a family might be picking some of these up. An outside agency might be identified as someone who could really help with some of those things. So going on to the next slide, I want you to think about what activities you did in high school. Maybe you could throw something in the chat. And I apologize if outside my door is really noisy right now. I don't know if that's being picked up, Tim, but there's like a big truck out there. So think about the activities you did in high school. So I'll say for me first, you put it in the chat or just shout it out. I did choir, a lot of choir. I participated in debate and I did plays. I was in a lot of plays when I was in high school. All of these things helped me decide what I wanted to do next and help me develop some skills. What are some of the things that you did in high school? Tim said band and theater. Clearly the 2 theater nerds of the group today. All right. Participated in some clubs like Students Against Drunk Driving, tennis, yearbook, sports. So these are all things that our Individuals with Disabilities Education Act tells us are accessible to all students. And so schools should be helping students find the best ways to access all these activities that are, enhancing students' learning in high school. So be thinking about clubs and activities when you think about transition services, because these might be great avenues for working on some of these skills. So participating in a club, participating in a sport can really help develop some skills. And they might be things that you would add to that high school plan. And particularly if it's a club or a sport that your child might need some help accessing, because they should be ways to make that happen in the high school if there's a need for support there. And that's the kind of things that we would write into an IEP. Okay. All right, moving forward. Any questions about transition services before we move on to writing a course of study? All right. So the next thing that the team should be thinking about is the course of study. Can you go to the next slide, please? Course of study questions are, what activities and classes the student will participate in during high school? So kind of like we were talking about before, but also we're thinking about credit courses as well, right? And and any kind of elective classes that we think are going to be important for their goals outside of high school. How many years will the students spend in high school to complete those classes and experiences, knowing that students on an IEP can attend school through 21? And is this plan aligned with the students' post-secondary goals? Okay, so you can see now as we move down our little org chart, all of these questions are designed to help you put together a really unified plan that's going to be geared toward optimizing success post-high in those post-secondary goals, right? So a really good course of study, and I will say we don't always see like a perfect course of study when we're working with students, is that we would have all 4 years of high school mapped out. What classes your kids are going to take, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, super senior, post-high classroom. So some kids will go on to a transition program. And we want to be thinking, well, what are they going to get in that program after they're done with the 4 years they have in general education classes? Mapping out the course of study is really helpful. And again, Laura might say, well, do we have to adhere to that all 4 years? No, it can change. We know for certain students who are going for a standard diploma, there are credits that we have to be thinking about, how many math classes, how many English. But since we know that students on IEPs can attend school through 21 if they need to, it's possible you might want to take those across more than just 4 years, right? And so that you can fit in other classes that might be equally important that would help with things like independent living skills, or help students get experience in the careers that they're interested in pursuing after high school, to make sure, are those careers a good fit for them? Are they things that once they experience them, they still are interested in? Okay. So mapping out a really good course of study. So what classes they're going to take across all their high school experiences, it can be really, really helpful. Okay. And next. Oh, go ahead.
Kate, just a question. Is this also where you want to consider, when you're talking about the course of study, any relationship with like a community college for dual enrollment courses? And if they have an academic, if they want more academics after high school, that, they have access, even though they're in special education, that they would also have access to those dual education courses.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so we know, I don't know how many of you belong to MMSD, which is our Madison school district, but in MMSD, we have a really nice program called Campus Connect, which connects us to Madison College. And so students can apply to be part of Campus Connect, and then they can be in high school, but take classes at Madison College. So it offers them a whole bunch more class options, plus some supported experience in a college campus, because they're still case managed by the high school, but they're attending classes at Madison College. And so that would be something you for sure would want to be thinking about when you're developing a course of study, because you want to plan for that.
Kate, can I ask a question quick?
Sure.
So can a school, so one thing I've always kind of struggled with our daughter's IEP is just not exactly knowing what is legal and what isn't. So at her high school, although the law states that a student on IEP can attend school through age 21, most schools have a transition program. Can a school say that if your child meets graduation requirements for high school, that they cannot be in the transition program? Because that's kind of what we've been facing, is that because our child has met, well, she has 1.5 credits left, she's in her senior year, that we're kind of hearing that that's only for students who aren't capable of meeting graduation requirements on time.
Well, I think aren't capable would be my question, right? I think that it's sort of halfway in between, right? Some schools have a program that they see as the post 4 years of high school program for all students who need to continue on. And sometimes they don't understand that an IEP is an individualized program. And so it should be what your child needs, not what program they fit into, that determines how long they stay in high school. So I think part of that is somewhat correct in that you can, once you issue a diploma, you're done. But we as an IEP team decide when they're done. And so we would postpone that diploma and say, no, actually, we want to add these classes to the transition plan, because we know based on data and based on our evaluations that these are still some skills that our student needs to be working on to enable them to best meet their post-secondary goals. So it kind of all has to tie back to the plan, if that makes sense. If your plan is, so let's say, for example, I don't know what your specific situation is with your child, but let's say, for example, they're very academically skilled students, but they're not great at getting homework turned in on time, and you're the one who's really having to sit right next to them and make sure they know which assignments they have and when things get turned in. Places like Campus Connect can be a really great way of testing out how independent they would be in college, and really get a sense of those, we call them sort of executive functioning skills that students have to be successful.
We're in the Sun Prairie School District though, so I've looked at that Campus Connect, but you have to be in the Madison Metropolitan School District.
Okay. Yes, but there still might be options for a student to continue on, and whether that happens in the transition program or whether it happens with like sort of a super senior year, where they could work on those kinds of skills that would enable them to be more successful based on their post-secondary goals they have for themselves. So I guess my question to you, Laura, would be like, what are the things you think need to still be worked on that are going to help your child be more successful once they graduate, and that the high school could help, teach those things.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. And if you need a good resource for what's legal, Department of Public Instruction has a really nice website, and they also are pretty accessible when it comes to answering family questions. So there are some family liaisons at the Department of Public Instruction that you can talk to if you're having some kind of disagreements about what should be happening in your child's plan.
We've already had to get Wisconsin Disability Rights involved, and they ended up taking her case this fall, and it just seems to be such a struggle this year for whatever reason. So
yes, and
so they're a huge help too at Wisconsin Disability Rights.
Great, yeah. So other parents, that's a good for other parents to know too, that that's a resource for you. I also point parents to a website called Rights Law. So Rights Law has some really nice family-friendly explanations of IEP law and some of the things that families have sort of disputed with districts around things related to transition. So that might be a nice place to look too.
Was that just the common spelling of right? RIGHT?
WR.
Oh, it is W. Okay.
Yeah. And I think Tim will probably find it while we're talking and post it up there because I know him.
Okay.
But Rights Law is a good place to look too. But Disability Rights Wisconsin is a great resource. And, the unfortunate thing is not all transition teachers and transition programs know exactly how to best serve all kinds of students. And so sometimes it's a negotiation between families and service providers trying to figure out how we're going to meet the needs of every student. And I'm happy to talk more specifically if you want to get into the nitty gritty about your questions. Once we
Thank you.
finish, we can talk a
fine.
little bit.
Yeah, no, I don't want to be taking up all the time. Thank you.
No, that's okay. And if I could throw some resources your way, I'm happy to. So these are all great questions. Course of study is really helpful and important because it gives everybody an idea of what page to be on in terms of like how to best craft the IEPs. So then we move into our next slide, which is about interagency collaboration. So as you see there, we call it coordinating services with adult agencies. And this is a really important part of the process too. So moving forward to the next slide. The questions we want to ask are there transition services listed in our IEP that are included, that are likely to be provided or paid for by someone outside? So agencies, like Department of Voc Rehab in the example I showed you. So once they graduate, they're going to go to Voc Rehab and they're going to get this service. We want to make sure that Voc Rehab is at the table and agreeing that these are the kinds of services that are going to be provided for your child. So inviting them early is really, really important. So including agencies identified that would provide or pay for post-secondary services, having evidence that parents were consented in the invitation of the outside agency, and evidence that they were invited to the actual meeting so they could sit at the table with the team and really talk about what needs to happen. We like to see, I mean, it's a necessary part of the transition IEP that we at least are contacting these agencies that students are going to be talking with once they're done with school, or maybe even while they're still in school. Sometimes that's helpful too, just depending on what the trajectory is for each student in terms of where they want to get their experience. And so, for example, places like the Department of Voc Rehab might help them get some work experience in the summer before they graduate. If we're still trying to figure out what jobs we'd be good at, sometimes that's a fantastic way to find out what you like and don't like about work and where you need to build some skills to become a better and more successful employee. So I've known lots of parents who have applied to Voc Rehab while their student was still in high school and then worked in the summertime with the help of a job coach supplied by Department of Voc Rehab to help them, you know, apply for positions, or maybe even to help them like with some coaching on the job. Okay. So evidence of agency coordination is necessary in a transition IEP, and that should be something that your teams are talking about. Oh, and Tim just posted, so for example, every Department of Voc Rehab has a list of the high schools in their area, and they have like a designated person that is assigned to your high school. And so knowing who that person is, that should be invited to your meetings, or that should be starting to talk with those case managers as kids get older and ready for work. You know, you are welcome as a parent to invite anyone you want to an IEP meeting. So you can go ahead and invite anyone without telling anyone or asking anyone else's permission, because it's your meeting. But if the school district wants to invite DVR, they're going to ask you first.
Yep. And the other thing is, depending on what skills may still need to be developed in high school, is you may be able to find an advocate at DVRs that will sit there and say, you know what, this really needs to be worked on to really help her fully succeed in the workforce. And so depending on DVR and depending on what skills you're looking at that may be lagging in high school, you know, they may be able to help persuade the school to keep the child, you know, to see that there is some more education and employment work that could be done while still in high school.
And that kind of brings us to our final activity in the transition IEP. So looking at our org chart again, now we're going to write the annual IEP goals. Okay. I just want to, and I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the whole process of writing annual IEP goals because you've done it most likely for a very long time. But I just want to point out to you that this is the last thing you work on in a transition IEP. So if your team is working backwards, I would encourage you to kind of say, hey, wait a minute, have we talked about all these other things first? Okay. Did somebody have a question?
Chiffon, do you have a question?
That's okay. If you do, just feel free to shout it out, and I'll have Tim move on to the next slide.
I'm sorry, Tim, did you say something?
Just notice that you were unmuted, Chiffon, so didn't know whether you had a question or not.
Oh, no,
That's-
sorry about that.
Okay, nope, that's all.
Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Things to think about when you're writing annual IEPs. What skills and knowledge must the student attain this year that are necessary for achieving their post-secondary goals? So this is the charge of the IEP team, is to really start scaffolding these skills, because obviously there's never enough time in the day. You can't do everything. So you have to really pick the most important skills that you think are going to be really crucial for this year. And then it's so important to know what skills and knowledge the student currently has that supports their post-secondary goals, which kind of brings us back to last week, which was make sure you have a really good assessment in place, that so you really know what does your child know and not know related to what they want to do when they're done with school. Okay. And next, just a reminder, we should be inviting students. Please start doing it at 14. I even do it earlier, as I was a special ed teacher for 15 years. And I started inviting students to meetings 4th or 5th grade, because I just think it's really important to get their input and that they feel invested in the process. It's just, it has to be driven by the student, right? And it's mandated by the time they're 14, they should be there. And if they can't be there, there should be a justification as to why not. Okay. Next slide is just some, I believe it's just some helpful resources, right, Tim? So if you don't know about the Wisconsin Transition Grant, that's the withig.org site. It's fantastic. There's a ton of stuff on there that can be really helpful. And there's really neat resources on how to develop a plan. As a parent, you can go through and really, it takes almost like take a quiz, either an online version or a paper version, and just write out all sorts of information that will help you once you start developing your IEPs at the high school. So a transition overview is available on WITIG. The CSESA website is right there. And that is the project that I come from. It's a national project. So it's out of University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And we have tons of resources on that site too, curriculum that you can access, tip sheets for families and for students. So feel free to look that one over, or I could point you in a direction if you're looking for something specific. And then there's also the transitionta.org, which is a resource, I think more so for some of the assessments that we talked about in our first session. So this, Tim is going to be available to send this out to you if you're interested in having a copy of this CSESA presentation, so that you can have those links and you don't feel like you need to write them down. So we are done with the didactic portion. I know we only have a few minutes, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And maybe if we stop sharing, we can see each other a little bit better if we want to talk for a couple of minutes about any questions or comments you have about this presentation or about transition IEPs in general.
You had mentioned that there are assessments that you can get for like skill levels. And I think early in the presentation, you had mentioned that there's testing for independent living skills. would that be done through a private counselor, or who's responsible for doing that?
Yeah, so we talked about that in our first session. There's lots of different ways you can do it. Teachers can do teacher-made tests. There's some free things on the internet. And then there's also some standardized assessments that your school psychologist can administer that give you a good sense of like sort of the scope of activities of daily living.
So can you request that without having an
Absolutely.
IEP meeting? Okay.
Oh, well, you definitely want to make an assessment request. Yeah, so we talked about that a little bit last time. I would do that in writing.
I tried to access those slides because I missed the first session and I couldn't access them. I could see the, I couldn't access the slideshow part.
Oh, I'm not sure what that.
I will look into that, and I will also send out the PDF to you.
Okay, thank you.
I'll get that to you, Laura. No problem. I'll get it to everybody who's on the call.
Yeah, and there's some pretty standard independent living skills assessments that all school psychologists will have access to because you need them when you're identifying students with an intellectual disability. So that should be pretty easy for schools to do if they're willing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions or comments? Anything in the chat? Nope.
Just me.
Just Tim.
Just me trying to track down everything that you're talking about, Hank.
Tim, you have any questions or comments you want to add? Or
no, I think the things that I mean, number one, I think this is fantastic information, and I wish schools would really look into that there really is something more that has to be done to help that student transition from high school. That when the student turns 14, it shouldn't be IEP as usual. Is that there needs to be more steps looking forward to the post-secondary experience that that student wants to have. And that should start to be incorporated into, like you said, that course of study, into the experiences, into bringing DVR to the table. And what can we do while the student is still in high school to help ensure their success outside of high school? And I think sometimes schools just fall into the annual IEP rut. And they forget to look that this is also supposed to be focusing on transition.
And we're happy as a team here at the Waisman Center to, like I was saying before, this was initially a presentation that was for teachers. So we are available to provide this information to schools that are interested in. We can do free professional development for school districts who might be sort of struggling with how to best serve the needs of their students with autism at transition age. So, if that's something that schools might be interested in that you're working with, if you're seeing your district not really having ideas of how to do some of these activities, we're happy to hook up with them as a community resource and provide that training. So.
And to that end, would they possibly contact you, Kate?
Yeah, you can just contact me directly. So my contact information is there on the PowerPoint, but.
Oh, that's right, at the beginning. I think the beginning slides.
Yeah.
Now I remember, because it's not at the end. I'm like, I just looked at the end. It's not there. Oh, it's at the beginning. Okay, well, barring any last minute questions here, I'm not seeing any in the chat. Thank you, Kate. I'm not seeing any in the chat and not seeing any unmuting going on. So I will, again, just graciously thank you, Kate, so much for taking a couple of Wednesdays out to give us a little more insight about how to write really, really good transition IEP, ones that will help the students succeed. not just look good on paper, but that in reality make a difference in the student's life. So thank you all for being here. And I, of course, should do my usual thing of, what are we doing next week? But gosh darn it all, I just don't have a clue sometimes what I'm doing this afternoon. So I couldn't tell you what we're doing next week, but just give me a moment, please, please, please give me a moment. Oh my gosh. Please, 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 please let me do something. Here we go. It's weird when you have so many different places to type information into to find stuff, you type it into the wrong place. But would love to have you all back for, oh my gosh, November 24th, Hunter and Tim Talk Transition. So we're having a special Thanksgiving edition where me and my 23-year-old son, Hunter, who has autism and anxiety, and we've been doing some presentations together. We're just going to have a chat about Hunter's journey to adulthood and his transition journey. So come on by, there he is, and it will be a hoot. We're going to have some fun. We're going to have some laughter, and we're going to talk transition. So hope to see y'all next week. Thanks a lot, Kate. Thank you all for showing up.
Thank you.